To lay the groundwork for the cause of the Revolution of 1917, it's helpful to begin by laying out how the First World War went for Russia. Russia, at the outbreak of the war, assembled two large armies to invade Germany, which they believed would honor their commitment to their allies, the French, and potentially carry the chance for great victories and an invasion of Berlin, Germany's capital. Unfortunately, even though the Russian troops vastly outnumbered those of the Germans, they were outmatched and outmaneuvered, and in the battles of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes, the two Russian armies were defeated in detail and crushed. Thus, in many ways, the grand hopes of a Entente quick victory were also dashed as well. Things got worse for the Russians when the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, joined the war on the side of the Central Powers, joined the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The reason for this was, as the Ottoman Empire controlled access to the Black Sea, by joining the war and blockading and cutting off Russia from trade, they functionally blockaded the Russian state. This meant that Russia was going to be denied any help, whether financially, through food, through arms and aid from their allies, and thus was forced to fight the rest of the war on their own. And the war wasn't going much better in Europe either. By the end of 1915, the Russians were pushed out of most of Poland, they were pushed out of Warsaw, and in response to all of these failings, the Tsar took personal command of the armed forces. While this initially created a boon of morale among the soldiers who saw the Tsar as sort of their great father, what it really meant was that the Tsar was now going to be held personally responsible by the people, by the citizens, by the home front, for any failing in the war. And as the war continued, things were getting worse. The Russians were being pushed back by the Germans and the Austrians, and by 1917, problems of food supply, problems of logistics, problems at the front were convincing most in Russia that not only was the war not winnable, but they couldn't trust the state to fulfill or meet their needs. And so in February of 1917, strikes in St. Petersburg crystallized into a revolt against the government proper. This became known as the February Revolution because it forced the abdication of the Tsar and the creation of a new government known as the Provisional Government. Led by Alexander Kerensky, it's best to see this provisional government as an attempt by Russian liberals to try and take power and create a republican system of government. They're trying to put in place a broadly center-left government. But the provisional government makes one strategic decision that proves to be a great error. For many and sundry reasons, Kerensky believes that it is incumbent upon his new state to continue the war against Germany. Because of this decision, they opened the door to another political faction within Russia that is going to seize eventual control. In 1917, it was not only the provisional government that took power, but also a series of revolutionary social democratic councils that sprung up in the major cities known as Soviets. These were committed socialist organizations that were resistant to the provisional government and wanted to bring about broader economic and social change, let alone an end to the war. While the Soviets did represent a threat to the provisional government, they were somewhat disorganized. The Soviets did not realize their full potential until this man here was able to lead them in a struggle and bring about the Russian Revolution that we all tend to think of in 1917, namely a communist revolution. That man was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Born in Russia and then exiled for revolutionary activity, he moves around Europe. He's in Vienna in 1914, for example, and then moves to Switzerland. As a sign of the craziness of the totality of this war, the ends to which each power would go to win, Lenin is actually transported to Russia by the Germans. They put him in a train and believe that he might be able to bring about an end to the war on the Eastern Front because he, as a committed revolutionary, might be able to topple the government and bring peace. Given at that stage of the war the Germans are in desperate straits, that seems as good a bet as any. Now, Lenin is an innovator in the realm of Marxist theory because, well, he had to be. If you remember, Marx was not anti-capitalist. He believed that capitalism was a necessary prerequisite, a stage that was necessary to eventually achieve a communist revolution. The problem, if you were trying to lead a communist revolution in Russia, was, well, capitalism really hadn't taken hold yet. Yes, Russia had been industrializing, but it was still quite rural. It was still quite backward. Economically, then, it didn't really fit the bill for what Marx said was required to have a communist revolution. And so Lenin comes up with an innovation, which he terms the vanguard of the proletariat. Functionally, the Bolsheviks, his Soviet party, would take the lead, as it were, in bringing about the revolution. They were an intellectual class, they were educated, they were truly committed communists, and in doing so they would bring about the revolution and then, as it were, bring the worker up to understand why it was in their best interest that they had this revolution. In this way, he's trying to get around the problem of Marxist doctrine saying Russia is not the place to have a communist revolution. Marxist rhetoric aside, the Bolsheviks do hit upon a much more successful strategy of gaining public support. Rather than the provisional government, which is continuing the war, the Bolsheviks make a very simple promise: peace, land, and bread. As the war continued, the provisional government lost more and more public support. Not only was it the continuation of the war that caused problems, but the provisional government proved incapable of even producing some of the economic and social changes most people thought were necessary. Near the end of 1917, Lenin convinces his allies that the time is right to strike against the provisional government and overthrow it, and they famously storm the Winter Palace, depicted famously in Russian propaganda as this strike against tyranny akin to the storming of the Bastille. The reality is much more banal. The Winter Palace was largely empty. It was the Bolsheviks seized it largely without firing a shot. And in many ways, the sort of anticlimactic seizure of power pretty much was just a recognition that the provisional government had lost nearly all public support. So what do the Bolsheviks do once they're in power? The Soviets quickly commit themselves to achieving the end to the war and bringing peace. They are the government that submits to the brutally harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In this case, despite the loss of territory for the Bolsheviks, it's worth it because they need peace to not only fulfill their promise, but also to create the stability and peace necessary to build a new Soviet state. And in that peace, they began doing so quickly. They started working on the second part of their platform, land. They undertook a series of efforts. Factories were turned over to the workers and workers' councils. So the workers were achieving or controlling the means of production. Noble and church lands were confiscated and distributed to peasants. Bread, well, they're working on bread. The problem is all of this confiscation of land necessarily leads to a reaction against Soviet rule, which was not simply confiscating but also brutal. Lenin, during the early part of this period of solidification, will send 200,000 what will be termed whites, resistors to the Reds, the Soviets, to execution, up to and including the Tsar and the entirety of the royal family. And indeed, all of this violence and action by the Bolsheviks ends up bringing about a Russian civil war, where Reds and Whites fight it out in a brutal, devastating war. And the problem is, if Lenin was the politician who brought about the revolution, it would be his friend and compatriot Leon Trotsky who would help the revolution survive. He's the main military leader of the Russian forces, and he achieves victory. And indeed, this is a devastating war. It's estimated that over 10 million people died during the conflict, and so this is no minor struggle. But the real issue for the Soviet state moving forward is that even as it emerges victorious, out of this struggle, they lose their shining light, they lose their great leader. Lenin's health had been in decline by the early 1920s, and over the early 20s he suffered 3 strokes, eventually falling into a coma and dying in 1924. What this means is the leading light of the revolution is gone, just as the state is finally in place to put its mark, to develop itself fully, to show to the world what it means to be a communist state. This meant that as Lenin dies, what that state's going to be, what it's going to represent, what picture it will present to the world of what communism means in action is going to be left to others. And the question will be, would it be led by Leon Trotsky, the other agent of bringing about the successful Russian Revolution, or a new figure who we will encounter in our next module, Joseph Stalin?